今天晚上非常荣幸，台湾是他第一次来到，而台北是他的第一站。我们现在就欢迎 Dr. Helen Caldicott。
I'm going to read part of my speech. I never read speeches ever, but tonight I will. I come to you today with a deep sense of anxiety and concern about the health and well-being of the people of Japan and of Taiwan and of any other country with nuclear power plants. So concerned was I about Fukushima and the ignorance of the press that I organized a 2-day symposium at the New York Academy of Medicine on the second anniversary of the accident on March 11th and 12th, titled The Medical and Ecological Consequences of Fukushima, and it was addressed by some of the world's leading epidemiologists, physicists, and physicians who presented the latest data on Fukushima. As you know, the massive Great Eastern Earthquake and tsunami occurred on March 11th, causing the meltdown of 3 nuclear reactors within several days, and such an event has never occurred in the history of the human race. Fukushima is now described as the greatest industrial accident in history. Massive quantities of radioactivity escaped into the air and water and are still escaping as I speak. 3 times more noble gases, argon, krypton, and xenon, than were released at Chernobyl, together with huge amounts of other radioactive elements such as cesium, which causes brain cancer, muscle cancers, testicular cancer, ovarian cancers, strontium, which causes bone cancer and leukemia, iodine, which causes thyroid cancer, plutonium, which causes cancer in every organ of the body. Unfortunately, the people of Japan, and I'm sure Taiwan, were not informed of the accident and the meltdowns for 2 months. Now, a 1,000 megawatt reactor, which is like the 3 reactors very near you, and I would stress that there are 9 million people here living within 40 kilometers of those reactors. If one of them has an accident, you will never escape, you will never be evacuated, and you will all be doomed. That's why they must be closed down. A 1,000 megawatt reactor contains as much radiation as that released by the explosions of 1,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs. And the fissioned uranium becomes 1 billion times more radioactive than the original uranium because 200 new radioactive elements are produced, some which last seconds and some which last millions of years. And that's radioactive waste. And you've got it piling up at your reactors all over the country with only 2 more years of storage before you run out of where to put the stuff. Fortunately for Japan, for the first 3 days of the accident, the wind was blowing from west to east, so 80% of the radiation blew across the Pacific. I don't know how much radiation Taiwan received, but I'm sure you are within the plume of the radiation going across the Pacific. Then the wind changed and blew from the southeast across much of the Fukushima prefecture, heavily contaminating the ground with fallout, and Tokyo received a considerable fallout. Tokyo is very radioactive. 35 million people live in Tokyo. I'll tell you in a while how cancer is caused by radiation. So concerned was the Japanese government, they were considering plans to evacuate 35 million people from Tokyo during the accident. Thousands of people were fleeing from the smouldering reactors, and the government knew where the plume was going, but they didn't notify the people. So the people fled into the path of the highest radiation dose. To this day, the Japanese people haven't been told really where the radiation is. 600,000 people live in very high radiation areas. Areas that in Russia, after Chernobyl, were evacuated. So the Japanese government is far less responsible even than the then Soviet government. Isn't that interesting? I think that your government is irresponsible too, because from what I hear from listening to people, you are not informed about the medical dangers of nuclear power, and they give you all sorts of fallacious reasons why you need it to turn on your lights, which is not true. And the nuclear power industry dominates the debate. It's time physicians talked about this, because this is going to create epidemics of cancer and leukemia and genetic disease forevermore. And I will describe how that will happen soon. The Fukushima accident is not over. They don't know what to do about it, and every day more and more and more radiation escapes into the Pacific Ocean. You have a stream, a current, I think, that goes down from Fukushima near Taiwan. Is anybody testing your fish to see if it is radioactive? But they say it's going to take up to 50 years to try and stop the accident. 50 years. Nobody has ever had to cope with 3 nuclear meltdowns right on the edge of the ocean. Meanwhile, there's a building number 4 in Fukushima, and during the earthquake, it became very destabilized structurally. And they just removed all the radioactive fuel from the reactor core and put it in a big cooling pool on the roof 100 feet above the ground. 100 tons of incredible radioactive waste sits 100 feet above the ground. If there's another large earthquake, Building 4 will collapse. Down will come the cooling pool, the water will leak out of it, and the fuel will burn, releasing 10 times more radiation than was released at Chernobyl. That means, if that happens, you will be in great danger. They're talking about having to evacuate 55 million people from Japan, but if the wind's blowing towards you, it's going to be a catastrophe. The Japanese government is not asking anyone to come in and help them. They're trying to reinforce the building, to put a huge crane on top, to move those very radioactive fuel rods by remote control. It might take 1 or 2 years for that to happen. Meanwhile, if there's a big earthquake, not just Taiwan, but the whole of the Northern Hemisphere will be severely contaminated. I have 2 grandchildren in Boston. If that happens, I am going to fly my family out to Australia. Why? Because the air mass in the Northern Hemisphere doesn't mix at the equator with the southern air mass, so we don't get the radiation down here, down in Australia. You get it. However, the Pacific Ocean has currents that go all the way around all the time. And our fish is going to be radioactive in Australia. And already they're catching tuna off the coast of California that contains cesium from Fukushima. Don't buy any Japanese food. Don't eat any Japanese food. Don't eat any Japanese fish. All Japanese food exports should be banned from coming into Taiwan, and I'll explain why in a minute. Now, okay, let me explain how radiation causes cancer and what it really means and what are the elements in the reactors. But first I want to show you this is Japan. Now, where's the... So this is, you can see this is Fukushima, and that's a very, very high radiation area. And the blue is still very high, and you can see it came all the way down to Tokyo. And the brown means that all of this area of Japan has been contaminated with radioactive elements. And they will remain radioactive for hundreds of years. This is Chernobyl. And here's the reactor sort of mausoleum. There was a huge explosion here because a stupid man did a stupid experiment in the middle of the night, and the reactor blew up. And it burnt for 10 days, releasing radiation all across Russia and all across Europe and in Scandinavia and in the United Kingdom. In fact, 40% of the European landmass is now radioactive. People are eating radioactive food. The incidence of cancer is increasing in France. You can see there was no radiation there because the French, who are very arrogant, and they have a lot of nuclear power plants, they said the radiation from Chernobyl stopped right at their border, and it didn't get into France. Then they had to admit later that they had a lot of radioactive fallout. In Cumbria and Wales in the UK, there are about 300 farms growing lambs, and the lambs are so radioactive, the government went to the farmers and said, you have to close down your farms. And the farmers said, well, and they said, because your lambs are radioactive. And the farmers said, for how long? And the government said, oh, about 100 years. It's not 100 years, it's 300 years, and I'll explain why in a little while. So this shows that one stupid man at a nuclear power plant doing an experiment in the middle of the night can contaminate a whole continent for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. That's what nuclear power means if there is an accident. Now, where's my helper? This I want to show you is a chart of the radioactive elements in a nuclear power plant. You might only have heard of radioactive iodine and cesium-137 and strontium-90, but look at all the poisons that are made, 200, and sit in those reactors just to the north of you. So we'll start here, starting with radioactive hydrogen, which is called tritium, and I'll just quickly move through these so you see what I'm trying to illustrate. Beryllium, carbon, silicon, phosphorus, they're all radioactive and very dangerous. Sulfur, chlorine, argon, 2 argons, potassium, calcium, scandium, vanadium, manganese, where am I? Lost my way. Iron, cobalt, nickel, zinc, selenium, krypton, rubidium, strontium, yttrium, zirconium, niobium, molybdenum, technetium, ruthenium, and I won't name them all, but I'll just scroll down for you to get a visual idea of the toxins that are in these nuclear power plants. Some last seconds, as I said, and some last for millions of years, and we can't get rid of them. We are making carcinogens, cancer-causing substances, which will affect all future generations. Now, many of these elements escaped from Fukushima, and I'm sure some of them landed on Taiwan. And they're all in your reactors, just to the north of you. Radium. Radium is what gave Madame Curie cancer. She was so fond of radium, which she isolated from uranium, she used to walk around with a little lump of radium in the pocket of her lab coat. And she died of a bone cancer, and she was so radioactive they had to bury her in a radioactive waste dump. Her daughter also died of leukemia. So there's radium. And we go on to neptunium, plutonium, americium. These are very, very radioactive substances, terribly dangerous. Sorry, we keep losing it. Where's the rest of it? It keeps going backwards. There's something wrong with this. Sorry. Oh, it's not working. Anyway, I'll give up on that. And we'll end that. Now, I'm going to explain to you how radiation causes cancer and go from there. Can everyone see this board? So you know that the body is composed of cells, trillions of cells. And in each cell is a nucleus, and in the nucleus are the chromosomes, and on the chromosomes are genes, which control everything about us. But in every cell, there's a gene called the regulatory gene, and it controls the rate at which the cell divides. So if radiation hits the regulatory gene, it damages the DNA molecule. And the cell will sit quietly from any time from 5 to 80 years, and you don't know that your cell has been damaged by radiation. Then one day, the cell starts to divide not just into two, as it should, but into trillions and trillions and trillions of cells. And that is a cancer. It takes one piece of radiation to hit one gene in one cell to kill you. And when you feel a lump in your leg or your breast, or you cough up some blood, you don't know that this cancer was caused by some radiation you ate in a piece of sushi from Japan 20 years ago, because no cancer identifies its origin. But we know from many studies medically of people who've been irradiated that radiation causes cancer. That's it. Now, there are other cells in the body that are more important than those cells, and one is called the sperm, and one is called the egg. And you have half the number of genes and chromosomes in each, so when they combine, you get a normal cell, and it starts growing into a fetus and a baby. Now, every single gene in the sperm and egg is important. And we have human genes, although 99% of our genes are the same as chimpanzees, so we don't really understand things very well. Now, radiation can damage any of these genes. I have just found out that I am a carrier for a disease called hemochromatosis. And that means my then husband and I both have that gene because our son has just been diagnosed with that disease. And it's a genetic disease. And it's an abnormality in iron metabolism. So he can't get rid of iron. And it stores in the liver and the heart, causing liver disease and heart disease. He gets treated now by being bled every few weeks, a litre of blood, which lowers the level of iron. We all carry several hundred genes for disease, like diabetes, like cystic fibrosis, like dwarfism. There are over 2,600 genetic diseases described, and radiation causes mutations. So the more radiation we have in the environment from nuclear power and from medical X-rays and CT scans, the more we are going to see genetic disease happen over future generations, many generations. Now, what forms of radiation are there? I'll walk you through that now. First, there are X-rays. Hands up those people here who've never had an X-ray. You've never had an X-ray? Dental X-ray? Oh, you have. You have. See, we've zapped you all. Doctors are one of the biggest causes of radiation exposure. Never have an X-ray without asking why. Doctors are not God, although we play God. And you have to say, do I really need this X-ray? CT scans give you a very high dose of radiation. Do not have a CT scan unless it's absolutely necessary. Don't walk through the X-ray machines at the airports. Don't. Have a full body search, but don't walk through them. Because each dose of radiation you receive from the sun, cosmic radiation, from the rocks on the earth, from a CT scan, from an X-ray, from a nuclear power plant, they all do the same thing. Each dose you receive adds to your risk of getting cancer. It's cumulative. No dose of radiation is safe. No dose. Any radiation you receive can cause cancer years later. So be very careful, and doctors are very indiscriminate, and there's a big literature coming out. People who have a lot of dental X-rays have a high incidence of brain cancer, right? Women who have a lot of mammograms have a higher than normal incidence of breast cancer. Breast is very sensitive to radiation. So there are X-rays, and X-rays are non-particulate. They go straight through you. So when the technician says, breathe in, hold it, runs out the door, and they go zap, that instant you can be damaged. Your gene can be mutated, but you do not become radioactive, okay? Then there's gamma radiation, which is like X-rays, given off by radioactive elements that I showed you, made in nuclear power plants. Same stuff. Then there's alpha radiation, which composed of 2 protons and 2 neutrons emitted from an atom. This is a very large particle. Plutonium, uranium is an alpha emitter, and you can hold it in your hand, and the alpha particle won't penetrate the dead layers of skin to damage living cells. But if you inhale some plutonium into your lung or uranium, it goes down here, and the alpha particle just irradiates a tiny little volume of cells. And almost certainly one of them will mutate and later develop cancer. Then there's beta radiation, which is an electron emitted, and it does the same thing. They all do the same thing. They damage the gene to later cause cancer. Okay? No radiation is safe. Background radiation, we think, causes about 30% of the cancers we already see, let alone adding to background radiation by nuclear power plants. Now, a nuclear power plant operating always releases radioactive elements into the air. 2 studies done in Germany and France, looking at children less than 5 years of age, living within 5 kilometers of a nuclear power plant, the incidence of leukemia in the children is double, and the incidence of cancer is high in the children. It's not safe to live near a nuclear power plant, particularly if you're a child. Now, children are about 10 to 20 times more sensitive to radiation than adults. They get cancer much more readily. And it's interesting, little girls are twice as sensitive as little boys. Women are more sensitive than men. And the fetus is thousands of times more sensitive to radiation. And very important work was done by a woman called Alice Stewart to show that one X-ray to the pregnant abdomen doubles the incidence of leukemia in the baby. Okay? That's why when you are still having periods and you have to have a dental X-ray or another, they say, when was your last period? And they don't X-ray you in the second half of your menstrual cycle because you might have a little embryo in your uterus who would be very vulnerable to being irradiated. So people are very different. The sensitivities of people are very different, and children are particularly vulnerable. Now, what are the elements? I'll just give you a few of the elements that are made in nuclear reactors. One is radioactive iodine. And radioactive iodine goes specifically to the thyroid gland in the neck, right? And it's got a half-life of 8 days. That means in 8 days, you might have a pound. In 8 more days, it decays, so you have half a pound. In 8 more days, a quarter of a pound, right? So you multiply a half-life by 10, so it's radioactive for about 20 weeks. No, 10 weeks. Little more, 10 weeks. And then it decays away to nothing. Now this is a beta and a gamma emitter. So what happened in Fukushima was the people who were running away, but the government didn't tell them that they were immersed in a cloud of radioactive elements, including radioactive iodine. They breathed it into their lung, and it went into their thyroid. Now, one way of protecting yourself from radioactive iodine, if there's a meltdown and you know you're going to be exposed, is to take potassium iodide tablets, which blocks the uptake of radioactive iodine in the thyroid gland. Every person in Taipei needs to have potassium iodide tablets in their medicine cupboard. 9 million people. So then you will be aware that you live in great danger living within 40k of 3 reactors or maybe 4. That's the first thing. Now, the second thing is they're looking at children in Fukushima Prefecture under the age of 18. 12 have been diagnosed with thyroid cancer already. 15 more are suspected, and that's within the first 2 years. We did not see thyroid cancer in Chernobyl until 4 years. This indicates that these children got a big dose of radioactive iodine and all the other elements. So in other words, the people in Fukushima are at great risk for developing cancers for the rest of their lives, like the Hibakusha at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The normal incidence of thyroid cancer in children is 1 in a million. And yet the Japanese government has the audacity to say that all these cancers are not caused by Fukushima. The lying that is going on in Japan by the nuclear industry and the government, which are really one and the same thing, TEPCO and the government, and I think it's like this here with Taipower and your government, is really medically absurd. As a physician, I can't believe that politicians would lie to people about their health, because this is a medical issue. Then the next one I want to talk about is cesium, and I'm sure you've read about cesium. There's a lot of cesium that escaped from Fukushima. Cesium-137 has a half-life of 30 years, so it's around actually for 300 years. And you can't get rid of it. And cesium is like potassium, so it goes to the brain, causing brain cancers. It goes to the muscle, causing very rare muscle cancers. It goes to the testicle and ovary, causing cancers there or mutating genes. Nasty stuff concentrates in food. Strontium-90 lasts for 300 years too. These are both beta and gamma emitters. And strontium-90 is like calcium. So here's a femur, the thigh bone, right? And you get a little bit of strontium-90 in your thigh, and it sends out beta particles and gamma and mutates a cell that forms bone, and so later you get a bone cancer, and you have to have your leg amputated. Or it mutates a white blood cell in the bone marrow, and that white blood cell becomes malignant and fills the whole body up with white blood cells, and that's called leukemia. Leukemia means white blood. The last one I'll describe is plutonium-239. The body thinks this is iron. So it's stored in the liver, where it can cause liver cancer. It causes cancer of the lung. It goes to the bone because hemoglobin is made in the bone marrow, and hemoglobin needs iron. So it can cause bone cancer or leukemia. And in fact, because the body thinks it's iron, plutonium crosses the placenta into the developing embryo. The placenta doesn't let anything through. It's very protective, but plutonium gets through, which can kill a cell that's going to form the left half of the brain or the right arm. And that's called teratogenic. It also concentrates in the testicles, next to the cells that form the sperm, where it can irradiate the sperm so mutations are passed on generation to generation, and it can also cause testicular cancer. The thing about plutonium is it's almost one of the most carcinogenic elements known, such that they say 1/1000 of a gram, 1/1000 of a gram if inhaled into your lung will give you lung cancer. Hypothetically, 1 pound, you can't do this, but if it was distributed in every person's lung on Earth, 1 pound of plutonium, they say, could kill everyone on Earth. Each reactor makes 500 pounds of plutonium a year, or 250 kilos. And that's interesting because all you need to make an atomic bomb is 5 kilos of plutonium. And if you want to make a bomb, you can look it up on the internet. The design to make an atomic bomb is on the internet. All you need is a lump of plutonium like the size of a grapefruit. Plutonium has a half-life of 24,400 years. So it lasts for 250,000 years. And America is selling nuclear power plants all over the world. So when you sell a country like United Arab Emirates or Taiwan a nuclear power plant, you're selling them a bomb factory because they can get the plutonium out of the reactor and make themselves a bomb. Oh, but that's all right because it's peaceful nuclear energy, don't you know? So it's so dangerous. Japan wants to sell nuclear power all over the world. And these men, and they're mostly physicists, nuclear engineers, I don't think they really understand what it's like to treat a child dying of leukemia, or even to deliver a baby, beautiful baby that's born. I don't think they understand what life is about, until one day they might get cancer themselves. And then I know, because on their deathbeds they talk to me and they tell me all the wicked things they've done in their life. 53% of us are women, and we're really pathetic. We don't stand up, we nurture life, we give birth to babies. It's time we said, look, you've had enough, we're in great danger, and we're going to take over. Don't mention Maggie Thatcher, she wasn't really a woman. Okay, now I want to talk to you about what happens in the food. All of these elements and more landed all over Japan and Europe. So when say, cesium lands on the ground, the grass and the rice suck it up and concentrate it about 10 to 100 times compared to the background level. And then the cow comes along, and I can't draw a cow, except that's the active organ of the cow, the udder. And the cow eats the grass, and it concentrates more, like 100 times, in the cow's milk and the meat. And then a pregnant woman, a lactating woman, drinks the cow's milk, and it concentrates more in her breast. And as it passes through the breast to feed the baby, it can mutate a cell in the breast that can later cause breast cancer. And then the tiny baby is drinking the milk, and this concentrates most highly in the baby. And babies are so sensitive to radiation. So that's called biomagnification in the food chain. And I can't tell you, but so much of the Fukushima food is radioactive. And I heard that they're bringing Fukushima food here and selling it and advertising it, saying it's a good thing to eat. That is criminal. That's like saying, do you want some poison? Ooh, here's some nice poison. Don't worry, you won't get your cancer for 20 years. The government here does not understand. And we have to teach the government and you what the dangers are. That's why we're here. Now, in the sea, huge amounts of radiation are still being released into the Pacific, like untold amounts. So it gets concentrated in the algae, then in the crustaceans, then in the little fish, and then in the big fish, and then us. So that's what happens in the food chain. And of course, you can't taste it. It's invisible. And it takes so long to get cancer, except it's faster in children and babies. I'm a pediatrician, and I care deeply about the future for our children, or even now. And you know, the radioactive waste that is piling up, you've got huge amounts of it. You've got 2 more years of storage. I don't know what the total amount is, but in the world there are about 100,000 tons of this waste coming out of the reactors. 30 tons from each reactor every year. Tons. So, where are you going to put it? You have to store it safely, isolated from the environment for 1 million years. No container, concrete, steel, lasts longer than 100 years. And as these containers rust and fall apart, so the radioactive elements get out and get into the water and start concentrating in the food. And I can imagine generations hence, the people waking up in the morning, the breast milk is already radioactive, the food's radioactive, the babies are being born deformed, and I've got pictures of deformed children from Chernobyl. There are homes full of the most grossly deformed children with no legs and no arms and tiny little heads and tiny little eyes or one eye. And the babies being born deformed and children getting cancer at the age of 6 instead of 60 because they're exposed to radioactive elements in utero. And an increased incidence of genetic disease, much of it lethal. That's the legacy we leave to our descendants. Now, I know Confucius says that one must venerate the elders. But for me as a doctor and a pediatrician, yeah, elders must be venerated, and I like that too because I'm 75. But the most important people in our society are the children and our descendants. What is the legacy we are leaving to our descendants? And that's more important than the elders, I'm sorry. And that's what we must venerate, our children and our genes and our sperm and our eggs, and protect them for the rest of time. This is a public health issue greater than smoking, because smoking only kills the smoker. Nuclear power is going to kill people forevermore. Now, you have to educate your politicians and say, if you don't close those reactors down, no more reactors in Taiwan, and close them down, we won't vote you into office. But we have to educate people, all the people in Taiwan, through the media. And the doctors have to talk because it's a medical issue. That's all it is. It's a medical issue. Thank you very much. Oh, actually, sorry, I forgot a couple of slides. Wait a minute. Oh, I'll go back. Now, this is a pregnant woman, and here we're talking about radioactive iodine that goes to the thyroid, cesium, which goes to all the body, and strontium-90, which goes to bones. And you can see how it concentrates from the soil into the food. And the pregnant woman eats the food, and down it goes. But the World Health Organization and the IAEA and others, they ignore the human fetus when they calculate dangers. They ignore internal emitters, which are the things I've been talking about, these things. They ignore them. They ignore how long it takes to get cancer. And they only look at one cancer, thyroid cancer. But all cancers can be caused by radiation. These people, I think they're evil. I do. Because by lying about radiation and doses, they're killing people. Like in Fukushima and Chernobyl. I can think of no other term for this. Now, there's a very good biologist who's been looking at the birds and the insects in the exclusion zones around Fukushima and Chernobyl. And these areas are very radioactive. And they're finding mutations in the birds. So here, white feathers, abnormalities here, a strange beak, and you can see crooked tail feathers. This is all abnormal. And the birds are developing cataracts in their eyes. And after Chernobyl, many people got cataracts and couldn't see, because that's what radiation does. We're seeing it in the birds already. These are firebugs, and you can see they're mutant. You can see that their antennae are crooked, or one is missing, some legs are missing, and also you can see the face. It's like an African face, eyes and nose and mouth, but they're all different. So these firebugs have been mutated. Last but not least, this is a tomato from Fukushima. Do you all understand? What happens to tomatoes, what happens to firebugs, what happens to birds, happens to us. And we test drugs on animals to see if they're safe for humans. This is what is going to happen to us. And the birds he studies, the swallows, have smaller brains than normal. Many of the male birds are sterile. They can't reproduce. And they've got all these mutations, and they've got a lot of tumours. Therefore, this is an indication of what the future holds for us. And this is pioneering work. This man will get the Nobel Prize for the work he's doing. It's going to change radiation standards. But he's also at risk, because he's going into very radioactive areas. He's a very, very brave biologist, putting his own life at risk. Now I will end. Thank you.